it shows up, what the impact of weight bias is on the individual, and how we can address weight bias. First, this may be your first time hearing weight bias, but you've probably heard of other forms of bias, such as gender bias, race bias, bias against age or religion or sexuality. But weight bias specifically is negative attitudes, beliefs, judgments, stereotypes, or discriminatory acts aimed at individuals simply because of their weight. And this is being in a heavier weight or in a larger body. And so this can show up as stigma. So defining stigma, I'm going to use probably these terms interchangeably. But stigma is marking an individual as having a lower social value because of their weight, specifically weight stigma. And then discrimination can also occur. And so this is treating a person unfairly just because of a certain characteristic. And in this case, with weight bias, is due to their body size or their weight. There are two types of bias for us to just get a better understanding of how this shows up. There's implicit bias. So this is unconscious bias. This is our biases that we aren't necessarily aware of and tend to be automatic. It impacts individuals without us really understanding or knowing it, and then it's expressed indirectly. Whereas explicit bias is biases that we personally are aware of that we have, they're conscious and they're expressed directly. So an example of an explicit bias that I just heard recently was a woman wondering why she wasn't given tasks that some of the men in the workplace were given. And that's because her supervisor said, well, women aren't as strong as men, so I didn't think that you would be able to lift the materials that were there. So it was something that he was consciously aware of, that he thought that women weren't as strong as men, and so presented that as a form of explicit bias, whereas implicit is something that we don't necessarily know that we have. Where does weight bias show up? I think it's important by the end of this, you'll realize that it shows up everywhere. So it shows up in our interpersonal relationships. So that can be with, our friends. Unfortunately, it happens commonly with loved ones or with our family. It shows up in mass media constantly. So I'm going to, give some examples of this as well. But, we are bombarded by weight bias and weight stigma and discrimination constantly in our mass media. Unfortunately, it occurs in education. So not just what we teach, but how we teach as well. And then how we treat other people or students when we are teaching them. Being a pharmacist, one of areas of research for me is understanding where weight bias shows up in healthcare, specifically with interactions between pharmacists or pharmacy students and patients. And unfortunately, the people who should be helping individuals the most might be harming them the most with the weight bias or discrimination that they're exhibiting to our patients. And so individuals who are in larger bodies will have different interactions with healthcare providers than those who are in straight-sized bodies. And unfortunately, that leads to differences in care that they receive. And then it ends up leading to individuals not wanting to seek healthcare because when they go into let's say a doctor's appointment and they say, oh, I have a hurt ankle or my neck hurts, it's immediately attributed to, well, have you considered losing weight? Which isn't always necessarily the case. And oftentimes things like cervical exams are less likely to occur in women in larger bodies. Because everything just is attributed to weight instead of other culprits that it could be. And then the focus of this presentation is where weight bias shows up in the workplace or in employment. But like I mentioned, I really think that it's going to translate into how weight bias shows up in your life personally, whether you have received weight bias or whether you potentially consciously or unconsciously have perpetuated weight bias. So hopefully you'll realize that we can make adjustments to this with all of these different in all of these different areas. Here is a brief video that I'm going to show you about what we know about weight bias, specifically in the workplace.
There was this study out of Harvard last year that looked at how our biases changed over time. Researchers examined data collected over a 9-year period that measured implicit and explicit bias against certain marginalized groups. When people were asked to evaluate their own explicit biases, data showed that over the course of those 9 years, racism dropped by 37%, anti-gay attitudes declined by nearly half, and bias against high-weight people declined by 15%. But when they measured implicit bias, which are our assumptions and attitudes that we may not be aware of or willing to express, it showed something much different. The research found that people were drastically underestimating their own biases. Unconscious racism had only declined by 17%. Anti-gay sentiments declined by 1/3, and bias against high-weight people actually increased by 5%.
One of the things we know about intergroup relations is what's supposed to happen is when you have more contact with, say, a person who doesn't look like you, it should reduce your prejudice for that person the more you interact with them and the better quality relationships you have with them. And what's interesting about weight is that doesn't seem to be happening, and we don't really know exactly why, but we do know that stigma, particularly for weight, is really, really hard to reduce.
Studies show that these negative attitudes have had an impact on high-weight people in the workplace.
We live in a society where negative stereotypes towards people who have high body weight are very common. And those are stereotypes that people are lazy or lacking willpower or discipline or are even less intelligent than others because of their body weight. And those kinds of stereotypes and negative attitudes become translated into overt forms of unfair treatment and discrimination.
Michigan is the only state that has passed legislation that makes weight discrimination explicitly illegal. And there are a handful of cities that have passed anti-discrimination ordinances that address weight, but there is currently no federal law protecting high-weight people from discrimination. So how much weight discrimination is there in the workplace, and what can we do about it?
So I think that this video highlights what a lot of what we don't know about weight bias, but that it's a form of bias that we still aren't necessarily talking about or isn't getting the headlines that other forms of bias are, all being very important. So some thoughts about why weight bias happens. And so this video kind of highlights a little bit of it. But in general, in our society, being labeled overweight or obese has created this automatic labeling as being called lazy or unhealthy. And why is this? It's because we use this old system of the body mass index, or the BMI, to label individuals based on their weight versus height ratio. And because of the BMI, 2/3 of Americans are labeled as overweight or having obesity. And so that's, the majority of Americans. And, mainstream media, healthcare providers, our society believes that, or has made us believe that weight is seen as calories in versus calories out. And it should just be that simple. And so that just really narrows down what weight is into something that is controllable by the person, that it's someone's personal responsibility to be in control of what calories go into them and what calories go out of them. It's often seen as willpower or lack thereof if they are in these overweight or obese categories, and then feelings of failure when someone can't achieve these weight goals that have been established by the healthcare community and the pharmaceutical company. And then this is further propagated and worsened through media and diet culture. So if you're not familiar with diet culture, you are bombarded by it every single day, probably multiple times a day. And then this time of year, constantly, because we have like the in between, Thanksgiving and the winter holiday detox to help you I just got an email like help balance you through the holidays. And then we're going into the new year where all of the diets and scams are coming out trying to get you to lose weight, or this is going to be the magic trick. And it's been going on for a long time. So, I pulled some examples of, different ads that are just popping up. The problems with the BMI. So I always say that the BMI is BS because it really wasn't designed for what we use it for. So it was designed by a Belgian astronomer and statistician, so not a healthcare provider, to determine the average man based on men's heights and weights. So it was used as a population average for white men. So the BMI is not something that is easily translatable to men of color, to women of color, to people who are not Belgian. And so it's really something that we have really taken on as a marker of health or as a surrogate for fatness that really wasn't ever meant to be used the way that it is being used. And so now it's labeling individuals as underweight, normal weight, overweight, obese, and then the most stigmatizing of all, morbidly obese. Just based on these numbers that overnight can be adjusted and changed by the healthcare community, which was done, about 20 or so years ago, where they just overnight lowered the number of the BMI to change the scale. And overnight, a large number of people suddenly went from normal weight to overweight or from overweight to obese. Also, looking at weight as just this calories in, calories out really misses the mark of all of the factors that do contribute to weight as a whole. And I could go do an entire lecture on understanding weight as more than a behavior, going into the racial roots of fat phobia and weight bias. And I'll have some references at the end or resources at the end if you do want a better understanding of this. But this is really important to understand that weight is not just calories in or calories out, and that it's not willpower, and that we are meant to have body diversity and weight diversity. So yes, there are the nutritional factors and the physical activity, but there's also so much more that contributes to our individual weights. So our environment, both our physical and our biological environment, but also our socioeconomic environment, the culture that we live in, what we have access to, really can contribute to our behaviors and to our weight. But then also, age. It's, as a woman, we're oftentimes seeing that like our bodies should be the same as they were when we were in high school. And that's just not the case. Our bodies are meant to evolve and change throughout our lifetime, throughout the month. Just looking at our bodies and how they should compare to like a white man's BMI as a marker of our health really doesn't make any sense. Also looking at genetics, we cannot defy genetics by how many calories we're putting in and how many calories we're pushing out, because our body is going to resist that based on the genetics that we have. Also, just the life stressors that we have, our occupation, our customs, that sort of thing. But, with all of these issues, and I haven't even gone into, the adverse effects that weight bias can have on the individual, it's not seen as a legitimate concern. It's not a regularly discussed form of bias. So I'm sure many of you will have gone to sensitivity training and it's never been discussed before. I think I've been to several, and actually within this past couple weeks is the first time I've ever heard weight bias brought up as something, as a form of bias. It's not a protected group of individuals except for in the state of Michigan. So when I looked at our own human resources, this regulation doesn't address weight or body size at all. And when I called them, they said that it wasn't a protected group of individuals. And then, unfortunately, weight bias is oftentimes suggested as a method to control obesity. So this might show up as like incentives to lose weight or to get into a certain BMI category. We'll give you a bonus, or you get some sort of discount on your insurance. And so what this does is it just further propagates the issue by putting pressures on individuals, and these methods don't work. How does weight bias show up at work? It shows up in many forms. So it can show up verbally, written, through media, how the who's shown on the website, online. It causes unfair hiring practices. It causes lower wages. So women in larger bodies earn about 6% less than women in straight size bodies. Harsher discipline for employees, wrongful termination, and then these negative stereotypes. So calling individuals lazy or unmotivated, or thinking this, even sometimes unconsciously, unintelligent, sloppy, or lacking willpower. And when I kind of threw this out there as a topic that I was going to discuss, someone reached out to me and said, "Oh, I never really thought about this, but it does show up where I have a coworker who's in a larger body, and they don't ever invite them to events where we have clients that are going to be there." And so, that's just a really harmful, way that this showed up that they never really thought about before. So just thinking about ways that it can show up, and that it can show up really in all different aspects. And as you can imagine, this negatively impacts the individual who feels the weight bias. So I will say that there is literature to say that even if an individual isn't necessarily labeled as overweight or obese based on the BMI standard, if you feel like you are in a larger body or overweight, you can feel weight bias as well. And the psychological impacts of this include lower self-esteem. It can increase depression or anxiety symptoms. It leads to body dissatisfaction, and it can lead to disordered eating or an eating disorder, and ultimately a lower quality of life. It not only impacts them mentally and emotionally, but also physically. So one area that contributes to weight is chronic stress. Generational trauma and stress can lead to weight, but then also weight bias leads to a chronic stressful state and elevated cortisol. And so cortisol elevation increases appetite and leads to abdominal fat retention. And so this further propagates the weight bias process, whereas if they're feeling the weight bias, then potentially the elevated cortisol could lead them to increase weight. And then we'll talk about, the problems with dieting, and that ultimately leading to weight gain. And so it just further worsens the problem and can lead to increased blood pressure and disease burden, all just from the stress or the elevated cortisol itself. So now I'm going to go through our steps of how to address weight bias, both in the individual level, but kind of the system level. And the first step is to assess and identify your own potential biases. So this is an explicit bias test. And so this is, your belief that or that you explicitly express. So I'm curious if you could speak to the extent that women's feelings about our own bodies potentially influence our implicit or explicit bias. Yeah. And so I'll say that towards the end. And I think it obviously plays a large component of it, especially the explicit fat phobia, because we're constantly being told that we need to shrink our body. So I'll get to some of these questions at the end. So we'll keep going through some ways to address. I got a direct message. I was surprised by how much I had to think about some of the questions in the first survey. I thought my answers would be immediate, to not have weight bias, but it showed me where my biases are still very present about my feelings about my own body. Yeah. So, as I mentioned, weight bias can show up even if you have feelings that you are in a larger body or you see yourself in a larger body than maybe what your actual weight is or what your BMI says or what society may think of you. So obviously I have been privileged, and I'll talk about that when we talk about addressing our own fat phobia, but and I'm in a straight size, but that doesn't mean that I don't sometimes see myself differently or have that dysmorphia, that I am in a larger body. And so that in itself can cause these feelings that and are sometimes are reasons why that we continue to try and lose weight or be in a smaller body. But thank you for sharing that. So we have assessed our own potential biases. The next step is to address our own weight bias and fat phobia. So I have another video for us to watch that kind of can help answer some of these questions that you all have, but also describe another thought process or way to think about health and our body size and why it's not necessarily possible for all of us to meet these cultural standards that are quote unquote beauty or thin ideal. So we'll take a couple minutes to look at this.
There's a big problem at the center of our research on weight and health. What's the problem? Well, picture a society made up of dogs. Let's say poodles are the bossiest group. They're the ones you see down at the doggy park barking at all the other dogs about how to live their lives in order to be healthy. But the problem is, poodles think that every other kind of dog is just a really big, a really small, or a really fat poodle, when actually the other dogs aren't even poodles at all. They're terriers, or mastiffs, or greyhounds, or labs. And all of the thousands of different dog breeds have different lifespans and different health risks. Each one has evolved to use food differently for different specialties at surviving. Some for staying warm, some for running fast, and some for being strong. They're meant to be different sizes and weights. So the poodles think the mastiff should lose weight, but a starving mastiff never becomes a poodle. The poodles don't understand that dogs come in many more sizes than they can imagine in their poodle-centric ways. So this becomes a problem when it comes to poodle science. When the poodles did their weight and health research and made their claim that lighter dogs are healthier and live longer, they weren't comparing thinner poodles and fatter poodles. They were comparing poodles and mastiffs. So the recommendation for mastiffs to lose weight is based on the false assumption that if all dogs reach poodle weight, then all dogs will have poodle health. But once again, a starved mastiff just isn't a poodle. This poodle science doesn't even test whether a starved mastiff lives longer than a mastiff who has enough to eat, because one would have to compare mastiffs who maintain poodle weight to mastiffs that maintain mastiff weight. And it turns out that starving mastiffs regain weight, which after all is a much better thing than starving. But the poodles can only see that regain as a failure of mastiff self-discipline. Look, poodles are great, but poodle-centric health policy is a nightmare. Good science tells us that it's better to recognize and respect the ways we're different, because how we're treated, having good friends, having access to decent food, a place to play, restful sleep, and medical care make a huge difference in our health and longevity, for all of us, whatever our size.
I think that's a really cute way to showcase this next topic and how you can work on that internal fat phobia or those feelings that you're having that maybe my bias is because of the feelings I have towards my own body. That video also is a great way to educate your children on body diversity. So I'm a mom of 2, soon to be 3, and this is really important for me as well, as to showcase, that our bodies are meant to be different sizes and to appreciate the body that they're in. But if you have ever heard of Health at Every Size or HAES, it's a way to shift the focus of weight loss and weight management to health promotion and accept one's body in the form and shape that it it naturally becomes when we're no longer trying to lose weight or on a diet or attempting weight maintenance. And so, as mentioned, I'm a certified intuitive eating counselor, and intuitive eating is what aligns with health at every size, where it's permission to eat at any time based on your hunger and fullness cues. So it's not prescribing a diet or tracking macros or doing keto for a non like epileptic diagnosis. And then it's also joyful movement. So doing movement that someone enjoys that isn't just a structured or regimented exercise program, because what we know is that long term diets don't work, and neither do these structured exercise programs. And since, time, I think I've showed my passion a little bit in some of the previous slides, but this does go against what our current weight focused paradigm is that, having fat on our bodies, it's believed, it's assumed that it poses a significant mortality and morbidity risk, but really individuals who meet the BMI standards for overweight and obese sometimes actually in studies have been shown to have greater longevity. And then I've mentioned like yo-yo dieting. Actually, weight cycling is worse for these different diseases than actually consistently staying in a larger body or within this overweight BMI. And then there's this assumption that anyone can lose weight and keep it off with the appropriate diet and exercise. And I don't feel like I need to show a raise of hands, but I will raise both of my hands really high to show you that, this has not worked for me in my course of lifetime of doing diets repeatedly. And if I could go back in time, never starting one would, because I've always ended up back where I was or even worse. And then the psychological damage is even worse long-term over the course of time. Other ways to address weight bias is attending things like this. So having the sensitivity training and education and understanding that weight bias does exist. And then during these weight bias trainings, understanding the complexity of weight. And so I think that can help with that internal fat phobia, as well as understanding like, okay, I've been told all my life that I need to be in this body and it should be easy, well, really, there's a lot of other factors that are contributing to where your weight should be. And then inclusion and input from people with lived experiences. So I got asked the question, like, what got me interested in this? And, it's just been conversations with other people, but I always have someone on my side who has lived experience, because it's not necessarily their work to do all of it, but I also want their input and understanding in order to make sure that we're doing what we need to make a change in this discussion. And then making sure that the people who are hiring or promoting individuals have this sensitivity training and really taking any sort of discrimination or bullying or bias seriously, and hopefully eventually, changing these protected, having this change as a protective group of individuals if discrimination does come up. Additionally, create a safe space for individuals. So I work in behavioral health and psychiatry. So person first language is the norm for me, but it's not necessarily something that comes naturally to people. So, we no longer use the term alcoholic or schizophrenic. We use a person with an alcohol use disorder or a patient with schizophrenia. The same goes when talking about individuals. So a person with obesity or a patient affected by obesity, instead of an obese patient or morbidly obese, which is a stigmatizing term in itself. And then ask the person their preference if it needs to, come up. So fat has this horrible, this negative connotation where it really shouldn't. There's fat in our foods. There's fat on our bodies. And so most individuals will say, I call myself fat and I am fat. It's like, what color are your eyes? Well, my eyes are green. I am fat. And so it's just, we don't have this negative connotation towards green eyes, but somehow fat has, become this negative thing. Create a body inclusive space. So having equipment, but space to work in, like enough space to navigate, chairs that are large enough, blood pressure cuffs that are large enough for patients, or, at the College of Pharmacy, that was something that came up is A student in a larger body didn't have a blood pressure cuff, but they were able to practice doing blood pressure assessment. So making sure that you're having that space. Avoid body weight incentives and penalties. As I mentioned, those don't work, and, kind of change the weight loss narrative to maybe more of like, okay, how many minutes are you getting out and doing movement that you enjoy or going for a walk without having weight loss as the goal. And if miscommunication occurs, recognize it and apologize. And then ultimately, the goal would be to update our non-discrimination policies to include weight as a protected group or as a quality that could receive penalties if biases or discrimination do occur. One of the best ways, I think, personally, to address your own weight bias and fat phobia is to read more about it. I think reading about the racial roots of fat phobia is really what sparked my initial interest. So Fearing the Black Body by Sabrina Strings, and then also The Body Is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor are great resources that discuss that. So here are some books. And then changing what you see on your daily feeds on your social media. So I'm more on Instagram than on Facebook. So I've listed a number of great body appreciation, health at every size advocates who really will diversify your feed and show you that beauty comes in all shapes and sizes and colors. And if you're seeing the same thin ideal every day, it's never, it's not going to change your mind or your thought on body diversity or size. So I always encourage diversifying your feed in order to do that. So there's a list of those individuals there.